Canada built Nortel, BlackBerry, Corel, companies that didn't just compete globally, they dominated. And then, gone, bankrupt, acquired for pennies, erased from existence like they never mattered at all. You probably used their products. Maybe you're old enough to remember when a BlackBerry wasn't a punchline, but the phone every executive on Earth had to have. Or when Nortel was building the internet itself, patent by patent, fiber by fiber. These weren't startups that flamed out in someone's garage. These were billion-dollar giants that employed tens of thousands of people, that made Canada a serious player in global tech, and they all vanished. So what happened? How does a country punch above its weight in technology, only to watch its champions collapse one after another? Let's find out. Number 10. ATI Technologies, the graphics card king that got swallowed whole before AMD bought them out. ATI was Canada's graphics card champion, founded in 1985 in Toronto. They went toe-to-toe with NVIDIA for decades. And they didn't just compete. They won. The Radeon series. That was ATI. The graphics inside your Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. ATI again. By 2006, ATI was worth $5.4 billion. Not bad for a company that started in a small Markham office with 4 employees and a dream. They had around 3,000 people on payroll and were shipping millions of graphics cards every quarter. The tech press called them the other graphics giant, which sounds like an insult until you realize there were only 2 giants to begin with. But here's the thing about being number 2 in a 2-horse race. You're always one bad quarter away from irrelevance. They needed graphics capability to compete with Intel, and ATI needed capital to keep pace with NVIDIA's R&D spending, which was basically a money-printing press at that point. So AMD bought them in 2006 for $5.4 billion. Sounds like a happy ending, right? ATI gets resources, AMD gets graphics. Eerie one wins. Except that's not what happened. AMD immediately started bleeding cash. The acquisition was so expensive and so poorly timed right before the 2008 financial crisis that it nearly destroyed AMD entirely. By 2010, AMD killed the ATI brand completely, just erased it. Those iconic red logos. Gone. The Radeon brand survived, sure. But ATI Technologies as a company, as a Canadian tech success story, dead. What made it worse was that AMD struggled for over a decade to make the acquisition worth it. They had to sell off ATI's handheld graphics division, their mobile division, basically everything that made ATI interesting beyond desktop graphics cards. The building in Markham where ATI started. It's still there. But the company that put Canadian engineering on the map in gaming and graphics, that vanished the moment the ink dried on AMD's check. Number 9. Delrina, the fax software empire that couldn't evolve. If you used a computer in the 1990s, you probably used WinFax. And if you used WinFax, you used Delrina. Founded in Toronto in 1988, Delrina became synonymous with fax software at exactly the right moment. Every business on Earth was buying computers, and every computer needed to send faxes. Delrina's software was better than anyone else's. Simple as that. By 1993, they had 700 employees and revenues of $90 million a year. WinFax Pro was installed on millions of computers worldwide. They even had a hit screensaver called Opus in Bill that featured a penguin and a cat in various scenarios. Yes, people paid money for screensavers. The 90s were a different time. Symantec bought Delrina in 1995 for $415 million. Great exit, right? Except Symantec had no idea what to do with them. They wanted the customer base, not the innovation, not the people. Within 2 years, Symantec had gutted Delrina completely. The Toronto office? Closed? The employees? Laid off or scattered? The products? Discontinued one by one as email, and then the internet made fax software about as relevant as a buggy whip. Here's the kicker. Delrina was working on something much bigger than fax software. They had an early form software product. They were experimenting with electronic commerce. They had people thinking about what would eventually become cloud services. But none of that mattered once Symantec decided Delrina was just an acquisition to strip for parts. The lesson: sometimes getting acquired is the worst thing that can happen to you. Number 8. Corel Puff. Wait, they're not dead? Okay, technically Corel still exists. But let's be honest. The Corel that dominated desktop publishing and graphics in the 1990s, that company is long gone. Corel was founded in Ottawa in 1985. Corel Draw became the industry standard for vector graphics. At their peak in the mid-90s, they had over $1 billion in revenue. They were buying up other software companies left and right. WordPerfect, that was Corel. Ventura Publisher, Corel. They even tried to buy out Novell. Then they made one catastrophic decision after another. They tried to build their own Linux distribution to compete with Windows. That failed. They tried to build a Java-based operating system. That failed harder. They bought WordPerfect for $186 million and then immediately watched Microsoft Office crush it into irrelevance. By 2003, Corel's stock had collapsed from $60 to under $2. They sold WordPerfect, they sold WinZip, they sold basically everything except Corel Draw. A private equity firm bought what was left in 2003, then another one in 2006. Now, a massive private equity firm that also owns things like Dollar General and RJR Nabisco. The company exists, but the innovative, aggressive Canadian tech powerhouse that took on Adobe and Microsoft that died years ago. What's left is a zombie brand, kept alive to extract whatever value remains from people who still need desktop publishing software and haven't switched to Adobe or open-source alternatives. Number 7. Nortel Networks, the biggest Canadian tech disaster ever. You want to talk about a fall from grace? Nortel Networks is the textbook definition. At its peak in 2000, Nortel was worth 398 billion Canadian dollars. That's not a typo. Nearly 400 billion. They employed 95,000 people worldwide. They had a third of all the phone network equipment on Earth. 1 in 3 calls made anywhere on the planet probably went through Nortel hardware. They invented or refined so much of the technology we take for granted now. Voice over IP, Nortel. Optical networking, Nortel. Time division multiplexing, you guessed it. They held over 4,000 patents on fundamental telecom technologies. The internet as we know it wouldn't exist without their innovations. And then it all fell apart. The dot-com bubble burst and Nortel stock crashed from $124 to under $1. Accounting scandals emerged. Turns out executives had been cooking the books to hit bonus targets. The CEO, the CFO, the controller, all fired and charged with fraud. But even after the scandals, Nortel could have survived. They still had the patents, the customers, the technology. What they didn't have was competent leadership. Management made terrible decisions year after year. They missed the shift to mobile. They hemorrhaged talent. They couldn't compete with cheaper alternatives from China and South Korea. By 2009, Nortel filed for bankruptcy. The company was liquidated completely. Not acquired, not restructured, liquidated, sold off in pieces like a used car. Their patent portfolio alone sold for $4.5 billion to a consortium of Apple, Microsoft, and others. The equipment business went to Ericsson. The enterprise business went to Avaya. The campus in Ontario turned into condos. 95,000 jobs. Gone. Billions in pension funds. Massively underfunded, leaving retirees scrambling. The Canadian government eventually stepped in to cover some of the shortfall, but the damage was done. The biggest tech company in Canadian history vanished completely because of greed, incompetence, and a total failure to adapt. Number 6. Research in motion. BlackBerry. The phone that ran the world, until it didn't. Everyone knows this story, but it's still stunning how fast BlackBerry collapsed. Research in Motion had 14% of the global smartphone market. Their devices were mandatory for business executives, government officials, and anyone who needed secure email on the go. President Obama fought to keep his BlackBerry when he entered the White House. That's how essential they were. The BlackBerry Messenger was the social network for an entire generation before Instagram and Snapchat existed. You weren't cool unless you had BBM. The physical keyboard was beloved by millions who couldn't stand touchscreens. Then the iPhone launched in 2007. RIM's co-CEOs Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie dismissed it. They said it wouldn't appeal to business users. They said the touchscreen was a gimmick. They said security-conscious enterprises would never accept iOS. They were spectacularly, catastrophically wrong about everything. By 2013, BlackBerry's market share had collapsed to 2.9%. The BlackBerry Playbook tablet was such a disaster, they wrote off $485 million in unsold inventory. The BlackBerry 10 operating system was too little, too late. Developers had already moved to iOS and Android. BlackBerry stopped making phones entirely. They licensed the brand to other companies who made Android devices with BlackBerry stickers on them. The company pivoted to software, security, and automotive systems. They still exist. But Research in Motion, the company that made the smartphone essential, that made Canada a mobile tech superpower, that company died the moment they laughed off the iPhone. The market capitalization tells the story. At their peak in 2008, RIM was worth $83 billion. By 2012, $10 billion. Today, under $3 billion, they went from running the world to irrelevant in less than 5 years. Number 5. Future Shop, the electronics retailer that couldn't compete with itself. Future Shop wasn't a tech manufacturer, but it was a Canadian tech success story. Founded in Vancouver in 1982, it became Canada's largest electronics retailer. At their peak, they had 139 stores across Canada and annual revenues over $2 billion. Best Buy bought them in 2001 for $580 million. Smart move, right? Best Buy gets a foothold in Canada. Future Shop gets resources and buying power. Except Best Buy then proceeded to compete with itself. They kept Future Shop stores open while also opening Best Buy locations. Same products, same parent company, different signs on the building. It made no sense. Customers were confused. Employees were frustrated. And in 2015, Best Buy finally admitted the obvious. They shut down every single Future Shop store in one day. 66 locations closed permanently. The remaining stores were converted to Best Buy locations overnight. The employees showed up to work one morning and found out they'd been terminated. Effective immediately, over 1,000 people lost their jobs in a single day. The brand that had been part of Canadian retail for 33 years vanished in 24 hours. Why did Best Buy do it? Because Future Shop had become redundant. Keeping both brands alive was expensive and pointless. But the execution was brutal. No warning, no transition, just gone. Another Canadian tech brand erased because the parent company decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Number 4. Silicon Graphics of Canada, the Hollywood tech company. Jurassic Park. Silicon Graphics. Terminator 2. Silicon Graphics. The Matrix? You get the idea. Silicon Graphics of Canada was the subsidiary that built workstations and rendering systems in Toronto. At their peak in the mid-90s, they had hundreds of employees and were selling high-end systems to animation studios, universities, and research labs worldwide. Microsoft and Intel made normal PCs powerful enough for graphics work. Why spend $50,000 on a Silicon Graphics workstation when a $3,000 Dell could do almost the same thing? Silicon Graphics made terrible business decisions. They expanded too fast. Number 3. Alias Systems and IK. The 3D software pioneer that Autodesk absorbed before Maya became the industry standard for 3D animation. It was called Alias, and Alias was a Canadian company founded in Toronto in 1983. Alias built software for automotive design, to film and video games. Their tools were used to design cars at Ford and General Motors. They were used to create visual effects in movies. By the late 90s, Alias was a global leader in 3D graphics software. Alias had revenues of $120 million and employed over 500 people. Then Silicon Graphics, who owned part of Alias, sold them to Excel KKR for $57.5 million. Less than a year later, Autodesk bought them for $182 million. Autodesk kept Maya. That was the crown jewel. But everything else? Discontinued. The Alias brand? Killed. The Toronto office? Downsized, and eventually closed. Maya still exists, and it's still industry-standard software, but the Canadian company that built it from nothing? Erased completely. Number 2. Zellers, the everything store. That became nothing. Zellers wasn't a tech company, but it defined Canadian retail for generations, and its collapse shows what happens when you stop innovating entirely. Founded in 1931, Zellers became Canada's discount retail giant. At their peak in the 1990s, they had 350 stores across Canada. They sold everything: toys, electronics, groceries, furniture. Zellers was where Canadian families shopped. Then they stopped evolving. The stores got shabby. The selection got boring. Walmart came to Canada in 1994 and started devouring market share. Zellers tried to compete, but they were too slow, too bureaucratic, too stuck in the past. In 2011, Target bought the leases to 220 Zellers locations for $1.8 billion. They planned to convert them into Target stores and conquer Canada. Zellers was shut down almost entirely. A few stores remained as liquidation outlets. By 2020, even those were gone. And Target, their Canadian expansion was such a disaster, they pulled out entirely in 2015. Less than 2 years after opening, they lost billions of dollars. But Zellers was already dead by then. The brand that defined Canadian shopping for 80 years vanished because they refused to adapt. Number 1. Nortel. Redux, because it's that important. We're talking about Nortel again, because no other Canadian tech failure comes close to this level of catastrophe. Nortel didn't just fail, it was vaporized. Nortel represented a third of the Toronto Stock Exchange's total value. One company, 1/3 of the entire exchange. It took billions of dollars of retirement savings, pension funds, and investment portfolios with it. The patents Nortel created are now owned by companies all over the world. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Ericsson, they're all using technology that Nortel invented. But the company that employed 95,000 people at its height, the Brampton campus that was a monument to Canadian innovation, condos and office parks now. What makes it worse is that Nortel's technology was still ahead of the curve when they went bankrupt. Their 4G LTE equipment was some of the best in the world. If they'd survived just a few more years, they could have led the smartphone networking boom. Instead, Ericsson and Huawei carved up their market share while Nortel's corpse was still warm. The Canadian government tried to save them. Billions in loans and tax breaks. It didn't matter. When a company is that badly mismanaged, no amount of money will fix it. So there you have it. 10 Canadian tech companies that vanished completely. Some were acquired and gutted. Some made catastrophic strategic mistakes. Some just couldn't adapt fast enough. But all of them prove the same thing. In tech, you're only as good as your last product. And in Canada, even the giants can fall.